certainly Walt Whitman never gets old. It's always great to hear a beautiful Walt Whitman quote. So I am now absolutely thrilled to have the honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Carolyn Finney, who we heard is definitely mic'd up and ready to go.
Trying not to say anything. I know you all heard me out there. I'm so sorry.
Did you get enough tissues?
I got tissues. I'm ready.
All right, so Carolyn, right over here, is a storyteller, author, and cultural geographer, and we are so thrilled to have her here today. We're very excited. Carolyn is deeply interested in issues related to identity, difference, creativity, and resilience, and is grounded in both artistic and intellectual ways of knowing. She pursued an acting career for 11 years, but 5 years of backpacking trips through Africa, Asia, and living in Nepal changed the course of her life. Motivated by these experiences, Carolyn returned to school after a 15-year absence to complete a BA, MA, and a PhD.
And I will have school debt for the rest of my life.
As we all. Along with public speaking, writing, media engagements, consulting, teaching, she served on the U.S. National Parks Advisory Board for 8 years. Her first book, Black Faces, White Spaces, Reimagining the Relationship of African Americans to the Great Outdoors, was released in 2014, and 5 signed copies will be raffled off at the end of the day. So please make sure to stick around for your signed copy. She comes to us from Vermont, which took a while to get here, all the way from Vermont.
Yeah, but it wasn't too bad. You just have to, you can't, get to Philadelphia. You got to go to Newark, then you got to take the train, then you got to, but it wasn't too bad.
Very complicated. She's currently doing a 2-year residency there at Middlebury College at the Franklin Environmental Center as a professor of practice there. So please join me in welcoming Carolyn Finney.
I'm so unwell behaved. All right. Oh, a clicker. It's a beautiful thing. Are you Sarah?
Finally meet you.
I'm
Sarah.
Sarah. So we have been communicating for the last month, but I don't know who it is. So until I see it, it's like fabulous. Thank you. I have notes, but I tend not to pay any attention to my notes. So that's how it goes. So I have a mic. That means I can move around. Excellent. Well, so first I want to say thank you, Sarah, and everybody for inviting me here today. I'm really glad I could come and speak with you. I love coming to Philly, man. If I could find a reason to move here, I actually would do it every time. Did somebody just say, uh-oh, did I? Oh, right. Give me a reason. Sorry. Yeah, okay, so where am I starting? I'm gonna have to start. I always start with my own story. So I do this a lot, right? I've been doing this for years, some different versions. I work with, I would say, I travel almost every week. 50% of it is academic institutions. The other 50% is split between government agencies, environmental nonprofits, arts and museums. The whole idea about diversity, equity, inclusion, particularly as it relates to environment broadly defined. You've got a lot of folks, how can I say this very generously, understanding and realizing that, they got to do something about that and are concerned about how they do that, just the practice of what that means, what does that look like. And so they ask, and it's a hard conversation to have because let's get real. I'm here to talk about very particularly race in the environment. And you say the word race in any room in the United States, good luck. You can just watch what happens, right? So I know I'm sort of putting that out there in a really particular way. So, and a couple of things I want to say about that. I want to say, one, that we're all biased, including me. We all have biases, right? And biases aren't the same as prejudice, which is not the same as racism. There's a kind of relationship there. I just want to say that's in the room. But we all have bias. I believe that all knowledge is subjective. We bring all of who we are to bear upon anything it is we're trying to understand. I mean, you can only come into a room with your own eyes, right? So you're looking to it and you're grounding what you see based on your experience and your own bias, right? So I want to put that out there. I also want to say that yeah, I do this, it's the work that I do, it's how I get paid, I do this because, I pursued it in school, but really the primary reason I do this is because it's personal. It's personal, it's political, and it's intimate for me. And I actually believe it should be that way for everybody. So I got a little thing about that. And so I always have to start off by telling you my story, which I've told 1,000 times, because you know it's your story, but really for you to understand why it's personal and political for me, how I'm situated, and where my biases fall around this conversation. We were just having a conversation out there, and I've moved around a lot, and people often ask me, where are you from? And, you know, and I often get a little attitude, and I say, do you want to know where I live, or do you want to know where I'm from? And maybe about, do I say it like that? It was probably about 5-6 years ago. I was in Detroit, and I was at a street fair there, and this older black man, you know, started talking to me, and he said, where are you from? And I got a little attitude. I said, you want to know where I live, or do you want to know where I'm from? And he just looked me up and down. He said, you must be from New York. And I am from New York. I want to back up a little bit and talk about my parents, Rose and Henry. Rose and Henry are originally from Floyd, Virginia. Floyd's a tiny town. Actually, it's grown a lot over the time, but it was a small town back in the 30s, 40s, 50s in the state of Virginia near the Blue Ridge Mountains. It was a segregated town. They grew up high school education. They grew up poor. They grew up black. They still black. When my father came back from the Korean War, like a lot of black people who lived in the South, he thought, let me move north because he couldn't get a job. He told me that when he first got back, he saw a park ranger in a park ranger uniform, and he thought that looked like a great government job, so he went to apply for a job, and they just looked at him and said, I'm sorry, we don't hire Negroes. So my parents moved north to New York, and my father had 2 job offers. One, he could be a janitor in Syracuse, New York. Syracuse is about 5 hours north of New York City. And the other was only 30 minutes outside of New York City. You have had a very wealthy Jewish family called the Tishmans who owned a lot of real estate. For those of you who know Manhattan at all, the building that's now called the Kushner Building in New York City used to be the Tishman Building in New York City. So they had a 12-acre estate, swimming pool, lake, vegetable gardens, fruit trees, and they needed somebody on that property full-time, and that's the job my parents took. So those are the pictures you see are all pictures of the estate. The Tishmans came up on weekends and holidays. My parents we lived in that little house in the corner, which ain't that little, is the gardener's cottage. So my parents took that job. He was the chauffeur, he was the caretaker, my mom was the sometime housekeeper for the Tishmans. This is and was a very wealthy white neighborhood. To give you an idea of the wealth in that neighborhood, Harry Winston had property down the street. Schaefer of Schaefer Beer, for those older folks who remember Schaefer Beer, lived next door, and Wingfoot Golf Club is around the corner. We were the only family of color in that neighborhood until the 90s when a Japanese American woman moved in. She was there for a short period of time, and then she left. My parents wanted to have kids and thought they couldn't have kids. Now, what happened to my mother, I think, happened to a lot of women who were poor, regardless of their skin color. But she had gone into the doctor because she had had a cyst on one of her ovaries, and she went in to get the cyst removed. And without asking her permission, they actually removed one of her ovaries. And they told her, the reason we didn't ask you your permission is because we didn't think you could emotionally handle the information. So they didn't think they could have kids, which I greatly benefited from because then they adopted me. And then what I like to say is they relaxed, and they had my first brother. And then they relaxed some more and had my second brother. So for me, my brothers, it was like our own private park. The Tishmans came up on weekends and holidays. This is where we learned to swim, bike, do all those things outside. The story that I like to tell people in terms of when I got a sense of what it meant to be us with our skin color living in this beautiful, natural surrounding was when I was 9 years old. So I went to a public school, Mamaroneck Public School. I was walking home from school, right? I had a little afro on my school bag, not very impressive. There was always policemen patrolling this neighborhood. And so I was right around the corner from the house in the afternoon. A policeman stopped me. He was in his car. He said, "Where are you going?" I gave him the address. I said, 1,000 Old White Plains Road, which is the address. And he just looked at me and said, "Oh, do you work there?" I'm thinking, dude, I'm 9. I said, "No, I live there." I was a little confused. He let me go. I remember going home and telling my parents. My father got so angry, and he called the police station and gave them hell, and they never bothered me and my brothers again. But as an adult, I have to think about the logics of that. So I was a little kid, I had a school bag, the time of day, all the reasons why I would imagine that he might have stopped to make sure I knew where I was going. Did I need help? But to him, he had to question my very presence there. I want to jump ahead into the 90s. So now my parents have been on this land for almost 40 years. Mr. Tishman had died many years earlier. Mrs. Tishman was now fallen ill. And so the question became, what's going to happen to my parents on this land? Now, the relationship between Mrs. Tishman and my father is complicated. Sometimes I joke around and I say it's like the movie Driving Miss Daisy with Morgan Freeman. I never say it in front of my parents, especially my dad. But Mrs. Tishman had my father by her bedside when she died. It's complicated, right? To all the role that the Tishmans played in our lives. When I got married back at that day, she paid for my wedding reception. There's ways it's complicated about how that relationship of power and opportunity played out. But she wanted to try to keep my parents on this land. The land was worth over $3 million in the 90s. The property taxes alone were over $125,000 a year. My dad had made something like $20,000 a year. And for many complicated reasons, in the end, she couldn't keep them on this land. So she decided to have a house built for them in Leesburg, Virginia, because by now, my youngest brother was married with kids and settled. Me and my other brother were moving around too much. He was in Leesburg, so I had a beautiful house built for them there. She passed away. My parents stayed on the land until 2003 because they needed to find a new family. There needs to be caretakers on this land, full-time, all the time. So they finally found a family from the Dominican Republic who took that job. In 2003, they moved down. So at this point, this is when I'm now working on my PhD. And I have been thinking about women, environment, just all these issues. It's when it starts to get really personal for me, the idea of race and environment, in part because after they moved, about a year or so after they moved, they got a copy of a letter that was sent to them from one of their neighbors, which I have with me as well. The letter is about a page and a half long with lots of pictures of the estate. And it was a group called the Westchester Conservation Land Trust had decided to put a conservation easement on this property. And when a conservation easement gets put on a piece of property, that means in perpetuity, nothing can be changed. So it was letting everyone in the neighborhood know, like, these are the reasons why we want to protect this property, all the environmental values of this property, the wildlife on the property, where it sits in the watershed, the importance of us protecting this. At the end of the letter, it thanked the new owner for his conservation mindedness. Now, he'd been on the land 3 years, more or less. There was nothing in the letter thanking my parents who'd cared for that land for nearly 50 years. And just that fast, they were erased. So this is when it got personal for me, because I started thinking about whose ownership counts, whose presence counts. And then I started thinking about it in the history of this country. How many people get erased? And then we jump to something like black people don't, which is, I love it. In this case, black people don't camp, hike, don't care about the environment. This whole thing is a myth for me, right? And for me, invisibility is also about the lack of ability to say that you belong somewhere. So it got complicated for me, and this is where it gets personal. Oh yeah, let me try this one. Oh, that's the big house. You can only see the pool, but you can't see the pond there in front of it. So now when you go up, we tried to return about 2 years ago to see if we could get on the property. A big gate's been put on the driveway, which wasn't there before. So we couldn't get it in as well. Okay, so I'm trying to think which story I want to tell you next. The thing I forgot to say about this is how depressed my father got when this happened. Because he started talking about land, the importance of land, of having land in the family, of being able to pass it down. And then he got Alzheimer's, which is where he's at now, so now it's on a loop. It's on a loop in terms of what he's thinking about all the time, which I also carry with me. I realize that it's a lot easier for me to talk about how hard this has been on my parents than it is to talk about what it means to me to never be able to go home again. And so this question of land and environment and belonging hangs in the air there. I'm going to come back to that, but I want to read something else. So some of you may know the organization Girl Trek. Now, Girl Trek, they've been around. They got started by Vanessa Garrison and Morgan Dixon in 2012. It is considered the largest public health nonprofit for black women in the country. The idea is to get black women out walking, hiking in the outdoors for their health, right? So I have never met Vanessa in person, but we're Facebook friends, because you know how that goes. And so a little over a year ago, she posted this on Facebook, which I want to read exactly as she wrote it. She was in Estes Park, Colorado. She had just been in Rocky Mountain National Park out there. When I have a little more time to clear my head, I'm going to write a longer piece about being pulled over in the national park while I was driving a van full of black women down the mountain after experiencing a magical hike together. I'm going to tell you about the park police officer who approached my van with his hand on his gun and demanded I roll down the back windows so he could see who's inside. I'm going to tell you how he accused me of being drunk, asked me what I was doing in the park, and then told me if I cooperated, he wouldn't give me a ticket. A ticket for what, I asked. Driving too close to the car in front of you. That's a crime in Colorado. I led 3 advanced hikes over the course of 3 days this last weekend. I've personally brought hundreds of black women to Rocky Mountain National Park over the past 4 years. I've organized trips at every park in the country, inspired thousands of more to take a step in the great outdoors. I was on the cover of Outside magazine. I starred in a Christmas commercial for REI. I partnered with the Sierra Club to train outdoor trip leaders, was named a Yosemite National Park ambassador, and yet this man was asking me what I was doing in the park. He asked me while still holding his hand to his gun, despite seeing our hiking gear when we rolled the windows down. Asked me what I was doing there as if he wasn't standing on stolen land, and I was somehow trespassing. This is why I turned down opportunities to speak on diversity and inclusion in the outdoors. No, I don't want to be on your panel. No, I don't want to write an article or give a quote. No, I don't believe that things are changing. Diversity and inclusion? How about decolonization and reparations? When you want to talk about that, I'll be ready. In the meantime, we'll be back to the park next year, thinking we'll bring 1,000 black women this time. Thinking I'll pack a fried chicken sandwich and wrap it in foil and then eat it next to the lake next time because I can. Thinking I'll listen to some Tupac while I take in the views. Thinking I'll do whatever I want because I can. Because I have a right to be there. Because you won't scare us off. I belong here. We belong here. I like to read that. I mean, there's so many examples to remind people this isn't something buried in the past. It's not an outlier just because we're talking about the environment, parks, nice beaches, beautiful mountains, friendly woods. Actually, it's got everything to do with who we've been and what we haven't reconciled. So I started thinking about our history. Yeah, always put this up there. So I always put up this image, and this image you see is a collage of stuff, right? I've got up there stuff around slavery, Japanese internment, Mexican immigrants, the removal of American Indians. But right in the middle of the picture, I put this, it's a picture of President Roosevelt and John Muir. It's 1903, it's the overhanging rock in Yosemite National Park. It's supposed to be a seminal moment. I imagine they're having an incredible conversation about wilderness and national parks and preservation and conservation and how we should be in better relationship with the environment. I don't want to take anything away from them for that moment. But I started thinking what else was going on around the same time that they were having this conversation. So I like to go back even a little bit before that, 1862. I started thinking about the Homestead Act. I never thought about the Homestead Act before doing this research. I couldn't have told you anything about the Homestead Act 15 years ago. But now I think it is actually one of our most important pieces of legislation because it changed the way we relate to land. So in 1862, for the most part, if you were a European immigrant, you could come over, you know, the gun went off at midnight, you went out, you put a stake down on 160 acres of land. If you farmed, if you built a structure like a house, and if you stayed on that land for 5 years, that land was yours, free and clear. I just want you to think about that. That can't happen anywhere in the world anymore. There's nobody giving you 160 acres of land for free. And understand land isn't just about land. It's about economic and political power, and it is about your right to be able to say you belong. Now, I don't like to take anything away from European immigrants, because many of them were leaving a situation that I can't imagine, you know, how hard it was for them to leave, right? Something like 60% of them, when they came over and put that stake down, didn't make it. You could die from the common cold. Your closest neighbor is 100 miles away. I mean, this was hard. It was a big risk to take coming over, right? So I can hold that and understand that as a human being. And I also have to ask the question, who had to be removed from that land in order for them to get that land for free? Right? Because all this land was stolen. All of it was stolen. It doesn't matter how far we get down the road of history, all of this land was stolen, right? 3 years later, Emancipation Proclamation, enslaved Africans are freed. They're given 400,000 acres. And then white plantation owners said, we just gave people we had enslaved 400,000 acres of land. We just gave them economic and political power. And I do believe they're a little pissed off. And we're going to take all that land back. And for the most part, they weren't allowed to participate in the Homestead Act and get that 160 acres. So now we get into the late 1800s and early 1900s, and Muir and Roosevelt are talking about wilderness and all the ways we're going to, work together and relate to this park. But oh yeah, I forgot, Jim Crow segregation was in place. So Jim Crow segregation's in place from approximately 1890 to the mid-60s. If you were non-white, in particular if you were black, we already know you couldn't go to the same restaurant, the same bank, the same movie theater. We know all of that. But it's the same. This is what I try to tell people. Just because it's a nice park, a nice forest, a nice beach, doesn't mean somehow all of that went out the window. It didn't go out the window. It meant you had to think about every place that you went, including the beautiful outdoors. So for me, what's the conversation that Muir and Roosevelt, how are they addressing that? How do we understand that between 1890 and 1965, not only do you have Jim Crow in place, you have the Chinese Exclusion Act, Japanese internment. I mean, there's so many things happening in terms of who gets to decide who can participate fully and who can't. And the environment, nature, it wasn't immune from that anymore. I mean, mainstream environmental organizations, historically, I understand the discomfort at actually addressing that history, but that history is real. When we start to understand and look at the leadership of those organizations and say, why don't we have a lot of folks of color? Well, there's some really good reasons why we don't have a lot of folks of color involved in those organizations and in leadership positions. I'm going to have some funny stories soon, but you've got to lay out the serious stuff first, right? Yeah. I always put this in because it's my metaphorical afro, and because I carry a lot of people around in my metaphorical afro. So when I started thinking about, I wanted to go around the country and talk to black people and get their environmental stories, the big reason why I wanted to do this is because so many of them had never been asked, and I was told that a lot, what their story was. But I also put a lot of different kind of people up in my head. There's a lot of people I can't fit in there to show you that's incredibly diverse. So yes, I can have me some Toni Morrison and Cornel West, but I also have Albert Einstein and Carl Sagan and Jane Goodall. There's a lot of people who influence the way that I think about these issues. And just so you know, I actually did have an afro. I cringe every time I say, yeah, wow, who said that? Wow. Yes. I'm keeping it real. So one of the things that I often, with audiences and having these conversations, is talk about how do we come at these conversations? How do we hold this in the work that needs to be done? Do any of you remember who Jack Andraka was? This story is probably about 5 years old now. Anybody remember this story when it came out? So when he was 16, he won the largest science prize in the country. It was the Intel Science Prize for $100,000. And this was, I don't know if the video's up anymore, but this was the moment he found out he won. He was so shocked and surprised, and it's so wonderful to watch how thrilled he was. And he won it because at 16, he had come up with a potential plan for finding pancreatic cancer. So one of the reasons pancreatic cancer supposedly is so hard is that we have no early detection system for it. And he had a relative died for it. So he was sitting in fifth period biology, not paying any attention to the teacher, and coming up with an early detection system. And he went home to his parents and said, look, I have this idea. They thought he was crazy. They sent it out to 200 labs around the country. 199 turned him down. And then somebody at Johns Hopkins says, I think you have a good idea here, which is why he won. But the reason I like to put this up here is because a quote that he said. So he wins this prize. He's getting pretty famous, and he's on 60 Minutes. So Morley Safer, who used to be alive on 60 Minutes, says to him, you have to be really smart because you came up with this. And this is what Jack said. He said, quote, I don't think it's that I'm really smart. I mean, I know people who are way smarter than me. You can be a genius. But if you don't have the creativity to put that knowledge to use, then you just have a bunch of knowledge and nothing else. Somebody give that boy another $100,000. I also had heard Nikki Giovanni. Nikki Giovanni is a well-known African-American poet, won a lot of awards for her work, and I heard her speak in Oakland a few years ago. And one of the things she said to me is we have to learn different literacies. Sailors can read the stars, farmers can read the soil. What does it mean for us to learn different literacies, particularly in this kind of conversation? So I just want to throw that out there. And the last person I sort of want to throw out there, and some of the older folks are going to know who this is Moms Mabley. You know who Moms Mabley is? I love you. What? Excellent. So Moms Mabley came out of vaudeville. She was a comedian in the 40s and the 50s, and the 60s. The amazing thing, she'd be in front of predominantly white audiences. So that's how she really looks, the big picture. But what she'd do, she'd take out her teeth and put on a hat and a schmata, and she'd get in front of predominantly white audiences, and she'd talk about race in the 50s and the 60s, right? So this is when Jim Crow was in place. They loved her so much, she got invited to the White House. A few years ago, Whoopi Goldberg did a documentary about her and asked a lot of present-day comedians, how did she get away with that, right? She was saying some truth, and they still loved her anyway. And Arsenio Hall replied, well, she was sneaking it through the back door. And so sometimes I think we have to think about what that means for us, how we do this work. How do we get strategic? How do we sneak it through the back door? So I also tell some stories from the book. So I purposefully entitled most of the chapters of this book after Spike Lee movies. I did that on purpose. Some of you may remember Bamboozled. He was talking about how African Americans, the stereotypes of African Americans in television. And for me, I was thinking about that we've been bamboozled because there's this dominant narrative about the environment that we're collectively told and educated on. I'm not saying that narrative is wrong. Manifest Destiny, People Come Over, John Muir, Gifford Pinchot with forestry. This is how we're going to think about conservation, preservation, and wilderness. But it leaves out a whole set of experiences of, again, lots of non-white folks who were either brought here, came here, and couldn't integrate in quite the same way as everybody else. And how do we hold that story? I like to have to put this up. People often ask me, so what does LeBron James have to do with anything? I'm going to tell you what LeBron James has to do with it. So I like to put this image up because Vogue, it was the first time Vogue put a black man on the cover. It was 2009, 2010. He's with supermodel Gisele Bündchen. And when this image came out, a lot of black people got upset. And on the internet, they voiced their anger about this. Mostly the argument was, you finally put a black man on the cover, why is he looking all primitive? Why couldn't he just be looking more elegant, right? And so somebody uncovered this poster. This poster is from 1917. I want you to look at it right down to the color of her dress. Now, the editor said they didn't know anything about this poster. I don't know if I believe that. But even if I believe that, it actually says something about the consciousness of this country and where we've been. So in the 1800s, late 1800s, we used to have World's Fairs in this country. And the World's Fairs were an opportunity for us to get together and say, who do we want to be? How do we want to move, as a civilization forward, right? So you go there, there's a lot of innovative and creative things happening, and often black and brown people were put on display as the thing we want to move away from. I tell the story about Ota Benga. Ota Benga, around this time, was discovered. He was 19. He lived in the Congo, a young black African man. He was brought back to the United States. They put him on display at the American Museum of Natural History in New York as representative of the missing link. And because the museum folks thought, well, not enough people are going to go see him. So we're going to move him to the primate exhibit at the Bronx Zoo. Right. So there are lots of stories like this where black and brown people were put on display, were seen as something less than human, close to nature and the primitive. That makes it a really uncomfortable conversation when you get to this. So we have our first self-identified black president. What happens when President Obama gets in? You have people like Glenn Beck, conservative talk show host, talking about Obama's Planet of the Apes. You have that woman who was the mayor or whatever in West Virginia calling Michelle Obama an ape in heels. And it went on and on. These are not outliers. For me, it's rooted in something that's been around a really long time. And again, when people start saying, well, black people are just too sensitive, I said, well, not really, right? Because it's been around a really long time. It's important to say that LeBron James was also complicit because he got paid for this. That he for whatever reasons, agreed to this. Supposedly, he had pictures taken in a suit as well, but that's not the ones they used. So I'm just going to sort of let that hang there, but it's important to say that about him. I want to talk about something else as well. So 1964, the Civil Rights Act. I know that when I grew up as a kid, I didn't really know what the Civil Rights Act was, but I was aware of it because I lived with black parents and I had an understanding that this was going to be perhaps mean more equality. What I didn't know until I started doing this research that the same year was the Wilderness Act. Now, I never thought about the Wilderness Act again until I was doing this research, right? But when I read both of those pieces of legislation, what's really interesting is that you have two really thoughtful, committed groups of people looking at these legislation, but they're not talking to each other. And in particular, when you look at the Wilderness Acts, Howard Sennheiser and his group use what I call universal language about how we should be in relationship to nature, what we should expect, what we should aspire to. I'm sorry, when they're writing this, Jim Crow was in place. So who's the we that they were talking about? And as like to really push that point home, a Canadian friend of mine sent me an article. She said, oh, you should read this. And it was a white professor at Boston College at this time who was friends with this African-American couple who wanted to go to a national park. But this was the late 50s, early 60s, and he thought, well, we probably shouldn't go to a national park here in the United States. Let's go to Fundy Bay National Park in Canada. But here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to write the superintendent there. I'm going to say I'm bringing this African-American couple who are very cultured and educated, and I want to be sure they're treated with respect. He didn't hear back from the superintendent right away, but when he did, the superintendent said, I'm really sorry, I can't make that promise because we have a lot of American visitors here. The couple was Dr. Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King, who wanted to take a break from the civil rights work in order to have that respite in the woods, in the forest that Howard Sennheiser and his people are always talking about in the Wilderness Act. And this is the thing why you can't separate it, right? The idea, not even somebody as famous as the Kings could actually do that securely and safely. And I often say to people, you know, at one end of the continuum, you know, people can die because of racism. We understand live and die by that. But for a lot of us, we actually live in this place of insecurity all the time, questioning, can I be in this space? Will I be treated well? Will I be okay here? Right? And if we took the time to go around this room, I bet you a lot of us have multiple stories, I know I do, of what that means. One of the personal stories I like to tell, just to run the point home, because you can see me, you know, I like to dress, like I always think I have my stuff together. I was living in Seattle in the late 90s, and I love Seattle. I was working a temp job, so, you know, I was like in my work outfit. People were walking home downtown Seattle. I was walking to the bus stop. And I wasn't watching where I was going, and there was a pothole in the road. Right, and I stepped in it. And this is the first time I've ever fractured a bone. And if you've ever sprained or fractured it really badly, it's like you hear it before you feel it, and then suddenly it's like the wave of nausea, and you think you're gonna faint and black out. So I'm thinking all this is gonna happen. This is pre-cell phone days, so all you younger people, these are the days when you had to use a payphone. I'm saying this because I wanted to call my then boyfriend, and I couldn't do it. Right, I had to get to a payphone on the corner. People were passing me. I get to the corner, I'm bent over, I call him on the phone, I'm waiting, and I see what I perceive to be a young white family. It's a young man, a woman, and two small children standing there. And I'm so afraid I'm gonna black out. I've got my bag. And I said, can you help me, please? Not a single person helped me. They moved away. Not a single person in a city that considers itself incredibly progressive, with people I imagine are probably very nice people. I don't know the exact reason why nobody would help me, but think about that. That's that insecurity that so many people carry with them all the time, right? Is that what came up for a lot of people was the issue of memory, especially with black folks. When they're talking to them about the environment, their stories, their experiences, was the power of memory to inform who they are, both collective and individual memory. So I want to tell you two stories. One, you know, I'll go back to talking about my dad. So 2005, I lived in Atlanta, and I was working on my dissertation at that time, and I got my parents to come visit me. And I'm telling you, for me, that was a really big deal, because my dad is old school. Like, a man doesn't show any emotion unless he's angry. This is the way I interpreted it as his daughter. He scared me a lot because of the way he was, very stoic, very proud. And I said, we're going to do like the Black Atlanta thing. We're going to go to Dr. Martin Luther King National Park. Because my father never took us to any national parks, and there's a lot of different reasons for that. But I thought, oh, we're here, we're going to go see Dr. Martin Luther King National Park. If you've ever gone, it's right in the middle of downtown Atlanta. People live on the street. Ebenezer Baptist Church is on the street. There's a visitor center. I mean, so it's just a very lively, vibrant place to go to. We go to the visitor center, and my mom kind of wanders off. When you walk into the visitor center, they had it set up with all these dioramas. So there's all these images of the 50s and 60s, people protesting, police, things happening. There's sounds coming over the speakers. Again, people rioting, police, Dr. King's voice. There's a replica of Dr. King's jail cell. There's life-size images of people marching. You're just inundated. Your senses are inundated. It's coming in from all over the place. So I'm standing with my dad, Henry Lee Finney, who scares me, as I told you already. So his full name is Henry Lee Finney, and he hated the middle name Lee. So when I was really young, he was going to change it to African names. That didn't happen. He always hated the name Lee because he was sure it was after Robert E. Lee. And so somewhere around 2000, he said, I want to change that. How do I do that? Me and my brother says, here's what you got to do to legally change that name. So he did. So his legal name is now Henry X. Finney, which is the coolest thing my dad has ever done. So I'm standing with my dad in front of one of these dioramas, and suddenly, if I was close to you, I'd grab your arm. He grabbed my arm. Now, we are not the physical lovey-dovey family. That's just not, this was pre-Cosby. I mean, this is just not what we did. I'm just saying. Well, pre-Cosby, but pre-Oprah. Let's just leave Cosby alone. He grabbed my arm, and I'm grown, right? This was not that long ago, and it scared me because at first I was like, did I do something wrong? And then I looked over at him, and he had blanched. He'd just gone really pale. And what I thought was happening is that he was having a heart attack. And then in the next second, right after that, he giggled. And I always tell people, that scared me even more than the what's happening right now. And he pointed. And what he pointed to was an image, and it was an image of a sign that said, "For whites only." He pointed to that sign, which was part of the display, and said, I saw that sign, and for a minute, I thought we weren't supposed to be here. His memory had taken him back 40 years. He'd forgotten it. And for the very first time in my life, I saw him vulnerable. And for the very first time, I understood what he was carrying around all the time. Right. And that it still upsets me no matter how many times I told that story, because I saw it all happen so quickly, and he tried to self-contain it. He was grabbing my arm to get us out because he thought that's what had to happen. The other thing I want to say about that story is that we went on a tour of Dr. King's house. He ended up saying that he had a great time that day. He didn't think he was going to have a good time. So there was something about the way that he was engaged, also on an emotional level, that allowed him to show up as he is. But the other story that I want to tell is how memory's been used as environmental activism. Have any of you heard of the beach lady, Maureen Betch? Nobody? It's like, quiet. What? This is excellent. Well, her sister is actually quite famous, who's Janetta Cole, who's a famous academic. Maureen grew up in a wealthy black family off the coast of Jacksonville, Florida in the 40s and 50s. Her great-grandfather, A.L. Lewis, was the first man, black or white, to have a life insurance company in Jacksonville, so made a lot of money. But if you were black, didn't matter how much money you had, in the 40s and 50s, you couldn't go to the same beach as white people. So what did A.L. Lewis do? He said, we can't go to the same beach? We're going to buy a beach. So he bought a beach on Amelia Island. He called it American Beach. It's still there, right? So Amelia Island's right off the coast of Jacksonville. It sits in between two beach resorts. If you were a black judge, a black janitor, you could have a modest home, you could be on the beach. The sand dunes, those are the sand dunes which are kind of faded out there in the background. This is the context within which Maureen grew up. She went to Oberlin College. She decided she wanted to be an opera singer. She went to Germany for a few years. She had some success. And then sometime in the 70s, she became interested in environmental causes. First, she was supporting a man who studied the monarch butterfly. She'd give money to groups that would go off to Africa. Then she came back to the United States, and she gave all her wealth away to environmental causes, over $750,000. Her great-grandfather's house that had been bequeathed to her, she gave it away to environmental causes. Maureen was living on a chaise lounge on the beach. I said to Maureen, well, weren't you scared because it's a chaise lounge on the beach? And she said, no, because I had a big stick. Her sister, Jonetta, bought her a trailer for her to move into, which she promptly turned into kind of like a mini museum. So Maureen's holding something under her arm. That's all her dreadlocks. Her hair was so long, she carried it in a net under her arm. So you can see it's kind of hard not to see Maureen if she were to walk in a room. But she told me that soon after, her focus in terms of environmental became local, because that strip of beach was prime beachfront property, maritime forests, sand dunes, and on either side you had 2 beach resorts, Fernandina Beach Resort, Amelia Island Plantation, and developers were chomping at the bit to get at American Beach. So Maureen started to stir people up about fighting for that place, and it wasn't just about protecting the beach, it wasn't just about protecting the maritime forest, it was also about protecting the African American history and those stories in place. So Maureen would tell me she'd go to civic meetings, because you know they'll put up, they're about to change something, then they give the public the opportunity to come in. And she said, I'd go to a civic meeting. And she would say this to me, and I'd be like, Maureen, she says, I'd go and I'd stand in the back of the room, like nobody would see her. And she said they would be doing the Pledge of Allegiance. So she would join in. I pledge of allegiance to the flag, to the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice. And then she'd shout out at the top of her lungs, for all white people who got money, and all. And she'd be like, they heard me. I said, they heard you when you walked in. She worked with the Park Service to protect 8.2 acres of the sand dunes. There's been a book written about her, a film made about her. I take this story around the country. One of the points that I want to make, and this isn't about placing blame, is to understanding how few people have still never heard of who she is. So a lot of it is who we talk about, what stories we tell. For me, this is an incredible human story. And the fact that she's black actually just adds to that story. And why isn't it that we know more about this story and talk about it? John Francis, I know, good looking, right?
Oh, I'd say I agree.
Yes, I know, I think he's good looking, come on. John Francis? We got one, I make it, okay. Planet Walker, John Francis. In the 70s, John Francis lived in Northern California. An oil spill happened. He got really upset by that oil spill. He decided, I'm not going to take any motorized transport, I ain't getting anybody's car, I'm just going to walk everywhere. He said he had no plan for how long that was going to go. He said after about a week of doing that, he kept getting in fights with his family and friends, because you know how it is when they would try to get him to get in the car, he wouldn't get in the car. He said, I'm just going to stop talking about it. For the next 22 years, John walked across the US and Latin America to raise environmental awareness. He did it for 17 years without talking. John got his PhD at the University of Wisconsin in Madison without talking. What? In the late 80s, 89, 90, 89 is when Exxon Valdez happened. It was the first big oil spill that happened. He was the only PhD in the country who'd done a PhD on oil spills. So at this point, he's talking, but still not taking any motorized transport. He's working on some friend's boat in New England. He gets a call from some folks in Washington, D.C., who said, we don't have any oil spill policy. Will you come down and interview for this job? He said, sure, I'll come down and interview for the job. They're like, well, we'll send you a plane ticket, but I don't take the plane. We'll send you a train. I don't take the train. I don't take the bus. I don't take the car. They're like, how are you going to get here? He said, I'm going to ride my bike. How long is that going to take? He said, a month. They waited. He rode his bike. It took a month. He interviewed. He got the job. He's one of our early architects of our early oil spill policy. Back when John was walking and not talking, he said that somebody from National Geographic approached him, maybe in the 90s, and said, man, this would be a great story for us to tell in National Geographic. And if you look at National Geographic, they're always doing stories about people sailing their boats around the world, doing all kinds of crazy things. So what a great story this would be. He said the guy took it to his board at National Geographic, came back a week later with his head kind of hung down, and said they had decided, and this is how John interpreted it, that they didn't want to do a story about a crazy black man who spends his time walking across the US to raise environmental awareness. So what they just did in the back of it, you know, they put it in the back of the magazine in one of the issues, just a little story about him. So let's flash back up to 2000s. John decides he wants to write a book about his experience. He's going to call it Planet Walker. He had started an organization called Planet Walk. He took people to Cuba to have satellite systems set up so school kids in Cuba, school kids in the United States could talk to each other about issues of sustainability. He said, I'm going to write this book. He couldn't find anybody to publish it because we have so many stories about black men spending 22 years walking across the United States to raise environmental awareness, 17 years without talking. So he self-published it. And then National Geographic came to him and said, oh my God, we'll publish this. right? He became a National Geographic Fellow. He goes around the world with these stories. Hollywood bought the rights to the movie. They've had the rights for a while. At the time when they originally brought it, he was telling me it might be Will Smith. Then it was going to be Chiwetel Ejiofor. I want it to be Idris Elba. Let's get real. Often when I tell people that Hollywood is talking about making this story, people say, you know, Hollywood's going to mess it up because Hollywood often messes these kind of things up. And I say, I'm sorry. When is the last time you've seen a movie about a black man who spent 22 years walking across the U.S. to raise environmental awareness, 17 years without talking? I don't care who tells the story. The story just needs to be told. And think about the kids and the people who will come in, and this is what they're going to see, somebody like that who was that committed to ideas having to do with environment, so much so that they gave up their life in that way. And why aren't we hearing more about this story? Why isn't it out there? One more story. Well, I always say that, and that's not always entirely true, but I'm going to try to stop talking so we can actually have a conversation. I want to talk about Brenda Palms Barber. I purposely put up these pictures of people so it can change who we expect to see when we think about environment. Brenda Palms Barber is originally from Denver, Colorado. This is probably 10, 15 years ago. She got a call from some folks in Chicago who said, we have a lot of previously incarcerated black men and women. They come out of jail, they can't get a job. Can you help us think about what might be a good job? He said, okay, I can do that. That means I got to move there. I've got to become part of the community. She talked with the community. They thought landscape gardening, driving around the elderly. All these ideas seemed like pretty good ideas, but not great ideas, not sustainable ideas. So one day she's having a random conversation with friends. She said, this is random, it had nothing to do with this issue. And the woman, her friend started talking about beekeeping. And she said, oh, that's what we're going to do. We're going to make urban honey on the west side of Chicago. Which, of course, she said people thought she was totally crazy. She created this company called Sweet Beginnings that makes honey and honey-related products. It's incredibly successful. She said that for a year, after about a year of running the business, somebody said to her, you know, you're running a green business. She didn't even know what that meant. She said, because you don't feed your bees sugar derivatives, you're acting locally, is green. The story that I like to tell about Brenda is that when she interviews one of these young men or women for the job, everybody who gets a job in this company has to learn the life cycle of the bee. Doesn't matter whether you went to school or not, everybody has to know what that is. So she might be interviewing one of these young men or women, and she'll say, so you want a job? And they'll say, yes. And she goes, so you were in jail? And they go, yeah. Well, what were you in jail for? And usually they'll say, I'm selling drugs. And then she'll do a kind of dramatic pause. So were you good at it? And usually they say, yeah, until I got caught. What were you good at? Well, I understood the quality of my product. I knew the value of my customer base. And everything they rattled off, she said, that's great. We're going to transfer all that fine knowledge to this legal activity over here and making honey and honey-related products. And the point for me that I like to make, she doesn't consider that they're empty vessels. So people have heard me say this before. I try never to use the term outreach anymore. As someone who's been outreach to, I understand the general intent of outreach. But here's how I think of outreach. I come over, oh, you look, yeah, I'm gonna invite you. Don't worry, you don't have to do anything. I'm gonna invite you over to my table. I bring you up here. I put a chair for you here at this table. And then you have to learn everything about the table. You need to know everything about the table, about everybody around the table, and we don't actually have to learn anything about you, right? So it sets up a total power dynamic. This is not a relationship of reciprocity. This man and everybody else in this room are not empty vessels. They come in with knowledge, experience. The potential of bringing difference in the room is not about assimilation. It's about bringing it in and imagining that something new, a new idea will emerge, which means you have to be prepared to get rid of the table. Right? And I know it's hard, but so I want to put that there. And what I liked about Brenda Palms Barber was that she understood that they may have been in jail, but that didn't make them lesser human beings. That doesn't mean they didn't have an amazing idea, that's somehow creative and grounded. A few years after I interviewed Brenda, she invited me there to hear one of these young men give a talk, and he got up in front of 100 people. He was in a suit. He looked really uncomfortable and shy. He had his head bowed down. And the first thing that he said was, I never knew green could be so good to me. And really, it shifted for so many people what they understood, what they thought being green meant. He was part of the community. He was actually needed as part of that community. He could contribute to it as well as make a living. And how important that is to consider. How are we doing on time? Who's my time person? How am I doing? The rest of the time. Thank you. I love it. Okay, excellent. Yeah, you can ask me, but I could. So I put up this picture of Outside Magazine because before I went back to school, I would save my money and then I go backpacking for months, and I did a lot of different things around that because of how I wanted to do it. And I had a subscription to Outside Magazine, and Outside Magazine comes out once a month. They do adventure travel, environment stuff, all this stuff. And I never saw anybody who looked like me, right? So when I was doing this research, I thought, I'm going to count. I'm going to take 10 years worth of this magazine from 1991 to 2001. I want to count how many, yeah, I know, right? How many pictures in the magazine? How many pictures are people? How many times we see black people? Is it a man, woman, or child? And are they in an urban, rural, or suburban setting? And what are they doing? So when I counted about 4,600 pictures of people, more or less. There was about 102 pictures of black people, almost all famous male black sports figures in urban settings. Very narrowly defined for a magazine that talks about a wide range of environmental stuff, that they had narrowed it down very specifically for black people. Now I want to say, this is a little over a year ago is the first time they put somebody black on the cover, because the magazine is really working to think differently about who they have, whose stories they tell, and who they have representing them. One of the things I said to Outside was that here's the thing: a person doesn't know what they don't know. So let's for a moment take that bias and the prejudice and I'll take that off the table. People don't know what they don't know. So if you've got a whole bunch of writers sitting around and everybody looks the same, doesn't mean they're not different in terms of their own personal uniqueness, but if everybody looks the same, how do you expect them to tell a different story? So that's why, for me, it's who you hire. It's every aspect of doing this work to understand that if you're really saying you want difference, and I like to say difference even more than diversity, then really that has to be integrated in all kinds of ways within the organization, which means that some folks are going to have to give up power, but we can have that conversation. So the last thing that I'm going to say, there's a lot of other things, but then I want to open it up to a conversation around this. Two more things that I want to say. I always say to folks, there's a level of internal assessment that I believe we all have to do. We can do it within our organizations, our institutions, our agencies, but also personal assessment. And I'm not left out of that, right, either. So I like to put up these two images. The first story that I want to tell you is the white guy over on the right. His name was Ian Gibson. And this story is probably, I don't know, 4 years ago. So do you remember a story about an American dentist who was a sport hunter who went out and shot the grandson lion, Cecil of the thing? Well, about 6 months before him, Ian Gibson was in the news. Ian Gibson was a sport hunter. He went to South Africa, and he liked to hunt elephants for sport. He was out with some black men, white men. He got too close to a bull elephant, and it gored him to death. So he was 53. So I'm reading about this online, and I have a real hard time understanding why anybody would want to sport hunt animals. So it's my own bias. Elephants are one of my two favorite animals. I mean, I just feel like I had nothing in common with this guy. I read the article, and then I did the thing where you say you're not going to read the comments, and then you do. And I keep reading the comments. And by the time I got through the comments, I was actually in tears. Because nearly all the comments, save for one, said things like, he got what he deserved. One for the elephant. And they were so brutal that even in my disagreement with him about what he did, I had to ask the question, where's the compassion? Because this man had a family, this man came from a community. That had to be a horrible way to die. I can't imagine the last few moments of his life. And if he was alive, what kind of conversation could we have about this, right? So that's where I have to do my work. Where's my empathy for someone so very different from me in terms of my values and beliefs, and how are we able to sit down together? Because I refuse to give up my humanity to do this work. I refuse to become the oppressor. I refuse to do it. But that takes a certain amount of practice, like to stay on point there, because it's not like I don't sometimes get angry and just lose my mind. Because I do, sometimes. I put it up next to this image of this little African-American boy, which was from a story in Flint, Michigan. So this is about that lead in the water that people knew about for any number of years. And I think about all the children. We don't even know what the long-term impact is going to be on them over time, how that's going to affect their genetic system, their bodies, right? I have no problem over here with him because he's a child, little African-American child. It wasn't his fault. You know, that's not where I have to do my work. That's where I have to do my work over there. The last thing I want to say before opening it up is the question of risk, right? With respect that there are people who are taking risks every day by just showing up as who they are. So with respect to that, what it means to take a risk in order to gain something as opposed to a risk in order not to lose something. When people say that they want to make these changes, what that actually requires. A couple of years ago, Svetlana Alexievich won the Nobel Prize for her work on Chernobyl. And she's from Belarus. And she was on NPR, and Michelle Martin was interviewing her and said, you know, you made a lot of people in your own country mad. Because she basically told what she saw as the truth about the things the government did, what the people could have done better. Chernobyl killed a lot of people. You know, it destroyed the landscape. I mean, it was really problematic on a lot of levels. And she said, you made a lot of people uncomfortable. And what Svetlana said, she said, I'm not interested in people being comfortable. I love my people. I'm interested in them being better. The other thing I want to say is the question of who do we stand with and understanding how this is personal as well as political. I'm always standing in line at the airport, but I was standing in line at the airport, and there was a petite South Asian woman standing in front of me. And she started talking to me and some other women because we were delayed getting on the plane. And she admitted, she goes, well, we were like, what do you do for a living? She said, I go around the world. I've been to 75 countries to talk to companies about diversity. And she didn't crack a smile or anything. She might have been small in stature, but man, she scared me. She was like intense. And she said, you know, I go work with these companies around diversity. She said, empathy and sympathy are nice, but who do you stand with? And what does that look like in terms of who you stand with? So finally, I want to say, I always have two quotes here at the end, just to kind of get us into conversation. Albert Einstein says you can't solve a problem with the same consciousness that created it. You can't solve a problem with the same consciousness that created it. This is not, you can come up with 100 different practices up here on the surface about what we're to do, and that's a good start. But actually, if the deep work of change is not happening at the same time, for me, it's just a series of Band-Aid solutions that get laid over, right? I mean, this is 400, 500 years of things I believe we have never reconciled. I'm not saying things haven't improved since 400 years ago, but really, if folks are wondering why we're having a lot of the same conversations today, these aren't new. We haven't reconciled. Again, all this land was stolen. We killed or removed American Indians from the land, many of them still fighting for that. Standing Rock is not an anomaly, right? To understand we enslaved a whole other group of people. And historically, we've made decisions over time about who and who cannot come here. The Chinese Exclusion Act for me is always, there's something so crazy about it because who built our railroads? The majority of those people were over 3,000 Chinese people that we brought here to do that. If you look at the final picture of the Golden Spike, which is a famous picture about the last spike that went on the railroad, you will not see a single Chinese person in that picture. That is on purpose. We have been doing this for a long time, making people invisible. And I say we, right? Because I don't believe we're all complicit in the same way, but I believe that we're all collectively complicit, and there's a way to hold that accountability and think about how we want to move forward. So even though Albert Einstein said it really nicely, we can't solve a problem with the same consciousness that created it, I like the way Moms Mabley said it better. If you always do what you always did, you always get what you always got. Now I'll stop there, and then we can have a conversation.